Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Roger Domingo, thank you to Deusto for publishing my book, and thank you to the Fundación Rafael del Pino for hosting me in this lovely space and having the opportunity to talk about my book to a Spanish audience. I hope, am I okay in terms of the streaming? You can still see me on the camera? Okay. If there's a problem, let me know. So let me begin with a couple of definitions, because the term liberalism, liberalismo, has different connotations depending on where in the world you use the term. In the United States, liberalism refers to left-of-center politics, people who want more equality, more distribution, a bigger state. And in Europe, it has kind of the opposite meaning. It means people that are more interested in free markets, in property rights, and in restricting the size of the state. I think that both of these definitions encompass a broader meaning of liberalism, which really has to do with a couple of basic concepts, the first of which is the universality of human dignity, and therefore the universality of human rights. Liberals believe that all human beings are equal in their ability to make moral choices, and that governments have the duty to respect that autonomy by granting them basic rights, and that there's no particular group of human beings that is superior to other human beings in terms of those rights. Liberalism is sustained by a rule of law, by laws that limit the power of governments to interfere with the basic life decisions that human beings make in terms of where they live, what they believe, how they think, who they marry, the kind of work that they do, so that the protection of autonomy is central to a liberal government. And in my view, even if you are a more conservative government or a more left-wing government, if you protect those rights, then I consider you a liberal society, which means that Sweden and Denmark on the social democratic side are liberal states, but so is the United States, South Korea, other countries with less extensive social protections. All right, so as my kind introducers have explained, I want to defend what I call classical liberalism, because I believe that classical liberalism has been distorted and taken to certain extremes, which is why there is a broad attack against liberalism today. But I want to start by giving you 3 reasons why liberalism is a superior approach to social organization. The first one is simply practical. Liberalism is a means of governing diverse societies, and it's rooted in the origins, the historical origins of liberalism. So liberalism got its start in the middle of the 17th century after the European wars of religion. Following the Protestant Reformation, Protestants and Catholics were killing each other all over Europe for a period of 150 years. During the 30 Years' War, maybe a third of the population of Central Europe were killed as a result of these religious wars. And so at the end of that period, early liberal thinkers got up and said, maybe we ought to lower the horizons of politics, not to make politics over final ends as defined by a particular religious doctrine. Maybe just the protection of life itself is what's important, and we will have to agree to disagree about those final ends. And so people have the right to believe what they want as long as they don't interfere in the rights of other people. By the time you get to the 19th and early 20th century, the big argument is no longer over religion, but over nation, and expansive and aggressive views of national identity that held that one group has an inherent superiority over others, which then leads to the 2 huge world wars of the 20th century. And at the conclusion of those wars, again, there's a recognition that you need a liberal world order that respects everybody's dignity equally and that tries to reduce the tensions that had been created by these assertions of a very aggressive and intolerant national identity. And that is what created the world that we have enjoyed really for the next several generations, a liberal world order. Spain was a little bit late in coming to that order, but by the 1970s it had joined that broader club. And so that's a pragmatic argument for a liberal society. If you have religious, national, ethnic, other kinds of diversity, it's better to treat people as equal individuals rather than basing your system on the superiority of one form of final ends rather than others. All right, so that's number one. The second argument is a moral argument that liberalism protects human dignity, and human dignity in turn is based on human autonomy. That is, the ability of each one of us to make moral choices. This is something that is very deeply embedded in the whole Judeo-Christian tradition. In the book of Genesis, God commands Adam and Eve not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They do, and they're cast out of the garden. But that gives human beings a certain moral status that, unlike animals or the rest of nature, they can make moral choices. They can be led to understand the difference between good and evil, and they can choose good over evil. And it is that ability to make moral choices that really gives each human being that core dignity that needs to be protected. And so there is a moral basis for a liberal society respecting human beings for that moral ability. Finally, the third argument in favor of a liberal society has to do with economics. Liberal societies, among the rights that they protect the right to private property, to economic transactions, to free commerce, and as a result, liberal societies have been among the richest in the world. The earliest liberal societies, the Netherlands and Britain, were the richest and the founders, in a way, of modern capitalism and commerce because they were liberal in terms of protecting that right to transact. And subsequent countries that have become rich because they've adopted liberal principles, even China. So China today is in no way a liberal society except in the sphere of economics. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping, their reformist leader, basically instituted, in effect, private property rights, where Chinese citizens could keep the results of the work that they did and get rich. And as a result, they got rich very quickly in the succeeding generation. And so, although they are not politically liberal, they are economically liberal, and you would not have this miracle of growth in China were it not for their adoption of certain liberal principles. All right, so those are three reasons why you should be a liberal: pragmatic, moral, and economic. However, there are really major challenges to that liberal order right now that I think all of us are very aware of, and they come from both the right and the left. Probably the most immediate challenge that we see is from a revived conservative right wing that has adopted nationalism in place of liberalism. And I think you know the cast of characters that are leading this. You know, this is Viktor Orban in Hungary, Prime Minister Modi in India, Donald Trump in the United States, the various populist leaders, Zemmour, Salvini, Marine Le Pen, all of whom express a clear preference not for a rule of law that limits governments, but rather for a strongman ruler that is able to carry out the will of the people. These new populists are elected for the most part. They take their electoral mandate and they say, I am the representative of the people, I am executing the people's will. Here you have a judge or a journalist that is standing in my way. I don't want to have to accept that limit. And so they undermine the court system, they undermine independent media, they undermine free political competition, and as a result, they begin to undermine democracy itself. And this is done in the name of the weakness, the alleged weakness of liberal societies who do not have a single principle that they put as a way of defining their society. And they're right about this because that's built into the design of liberalism. And so in India, what is going on right now is that you have a liberal regime that was created by Gandhi and Nehru in the 1940s. The Indian Republic is a diverse place. It's diverse in terms of religion, caste, region, language, any number of dimensions, and it's hard to see how such a diverse society can live peacefully except under a liberal framework. And yet the BJP, the leading party of Modi, has been trying to shift that national identity to one based on Hinduism. And that means that, for example, the 200 million Muslims in India are not part of that national identity. And that is laying the grounds for violence, which we've already seen a very disturbing growth of in India. It happened in Gujarat when Modi was the chief minister of that state, and now it's happening in the society as a whole. Viktor Orban has defined Hungarian national identity in terms of Hungarian ethnicity, which then excludes people that are not ethnic Hungarians. I'd like to point out there was these four great Hungarian physicists, Edward Teller, John von Neumann, Leo Szilard, and Erich Wegner, all of whom met with President Roosevelt and helped to develop the atom bomb during the Second World War. All four of these people were Jews. They were not ethnic Hungarians. And by Orban's definition, they're not part of the national story. And I think it indicates, the advantages that you actually have in a liberal society when you accept people, you accept the actual diversity of people there. All right, so that's the threat. Democracy, liberal democracy, has been in decline. It saw a big explosion that really began here in Southern Europe, in Spain and Portugal in the early 1970s. It spread around the world. It culminated in a way in the fall of the Berlin Wall. So the number of democracies, liberal democracies, went from about maybe 35 in the early 1970s to 100, 110 by the early 2000s. But for the last 8 years, the number has been declining. Freedom House, that keeps track of democracy around the world, has called this a democratic recession, and it's also qualitative because that backtracking has been going on in the biggest democracies, the United States and India, both of which have seen the election of these populist leaders. And there's also a threat from the left because you have a more traditional left-wing populism, people who get upset and impatient with the fact that liberal societies are not reducing inequality, they're not taking care of marginalized people as fast as they would like, and so what they want is a stronger government that isn't constrained by a rule of law. And now in Latin America, you have the rise of leftist leaders for the first time in a country like Colombia that has elected, or Chile, that both of which have elected left-wing leaders that are promoting a much more expansive role of the state in order to deal with that inequality. And they say that liberalism is an outmoded doctrine because it doesn't move fast enough. So why is this happening? In my book, I talk about two distortions or deformations of liberalism that have occurred over the past 2 or 3 decades that have brought about a negative response. There's one on the right and there's one on the left. The one on the right has to do with so-called neoliberalism, which was referred to. Neoliberalism is not a synonym for capitalism. You can't have a modern wealthy society without capitalism and private property. Neoliberalism was a doctrine that took hold in the 1980s and 1990s that in a way idealized markets as the solution to virtually all public dilemmas and castigated the state as an opponent of growth. And they were right in many respects. I think many modern economies in the 1970s had grown overregulated. There were too many state-owned enterprises that were highly inefficient. And so there was a correction, but the correction moved in the opposite direction. And in my view, it moved too far. It moved towards deregulation of markets. Some of that was appropriate, but in the deregulation of the financial sector, it caused a huge amount of economic instability with the increasing tempo of financial crises that occurred beginning in the early 1990s when these policies were put into place, culminating in the big American subprime crisis in 2008, with a lot of other crises in Asia, in other parts of the world in between. And it resulted in a globalized world in which inequality was rising, and it was rising the fastest in those countries that were the most neoliberal, the United States and Britain. And that inequality, in turn, I think provoked a lot of the populist politics that we've seen in recent years, both on the right and the left, because many ordinary workers in rich countries did not share in the rising incomes of the world as a whole. A lot of their employment had been shipped to Asia, to other developing countries. It was very good for those countries, but it was devastating to the working class communities in the rich world. And this is part of the reason why we have this growth of populism in this past decade. The other deformation of liberalism is one that has taken place on the progressive left and falls under the title of identity politics. There's different kinds of identity politics, and certain forms of identity politics are actually, I think, compatible with liberalism and in fact are very important as a way of mobilizing populations that have been marginalized. So the classic case were African Americans in the United States. They were discriminated against formally up through the 1960s. In the 1960s, a black person could not walk in downtown Washington, D.C. because it was still a segregated city. And so it was very important for black people to be able to mobilize on the basis of the fact that as a group, they had been discriminated against, and they could push for legislation to overturn segregation, push for equal housing, for equal education, to actually live up to the promise that liberalism makes of equal treatment of all of its citizens. Up to this point, that promise has not been completely fulfilled, and for that reason, there are continuing attacks on liberal institutions for not having done that, but identity politics is a way of fighting back politically. However, there is what I would regard as an illiberal form of identity politics, which says that your identity, that is to say, an identity that you're born with, your ethnicity, your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, or your inherited religious beliefs, that's the most important thing about you, and it's more important than who you are as an individual, the kinds of moral choices and achievements and work that you do as an individual, and that the state will take your identity as the dominant way that it interacts with you. Now, it's understandable in terms of the kind of injustice that different groups have faced, but in the end, this kind of left-wing identity politics begins to undermine the foundations of liberalism itself. So in the United States, you're probably quite aware, we're awash in so-called woke liberalism, in which there's a undue sensitivity on these precise issues of gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, that has produced, sharp cleavages over whether societies ought to, give privileges to people in these particular categories. And it's also led to restrictions on speech, so-called cancel culture, where if you don't express the correct progressive opinion, you lose your job, you're shunned on social media, and the like. And so there's both, a right-wing attack on liberal values and practices and a left-wing attack. My personal opinion, just as an American, I think right now in my country, the right-wing attack is much more serious. We can maybe discuss this in the questions and answers, but the right in the United States basically has gotten to the point where it's bought on to Trump's claim that Joe Biden became president as a result of massive fraud, which is a complete lie, and they are putting themselves in a position to overturn the next election successfully in 2024 if they're given the opportunity to do that. So I think they represent a clear and present danger. The danger from the left is a longer-term cultural one, which has to do with the way that young people think about themselves and whether they think about themselves as individuals or members of these collective groups. And that, I think, is going to be a problem that will be with us well into the future. Now, there's another set of issues that I think came to the fore during the COVID pandemic, which really has to do with our cognitive ability to basically deal with basic facts, information, truth. One of the things associated with classical liberalism is a certain cognitive mode that we call modern natural science. Under this way of thinking, there is an objective reality that is different from what goes on in our subjective consciousnesses. We can interpret that reality using an experimental method. We can understand causality, and therefore we can manipulate that outside world. And this is really what's laid the basis for, modern natural science has laid the basis for the technological manipulation of the world, which then has created the wealth that we all enjoy today. But there's been a critique of modern natural science that actually starts on the left and then migrates over now to the right, that is undermining the basis of our ability to agree on basic factual information. I have a chapter in my book that actually is a little bit autobiographical, because when I was young, I went to France and I studied with many postmodernist authors like Jacques Derrida. I met Michel Foucault when I was still in university, and I'm very aware of this line of argument. But what the postmodernist thinkers did was to begin to assert the basic subjectivity of knowledge, that the words we use to talk about reality actually shape that reality and impose our subjective view onto, what we believe is an objective world on the outside. And in many respects, this leads to a kind of relativism, that there is no objective reality out there, that each of us has our own subjective viewpoints that we impose on the world. It comes together really in the writings of Michel Foucault. He's a really brilliant writer, and he begins to argue that modern natural science itself is not the objective approach to reality that it claims to be, but actually reflects the interests of certain hidden elites that are using science to manipulate other people. He said, in the old days, if you were a leader, you were a king or a monarch, you could simply order the death of your subjects. Today, we can't do that, so we need a more subtle method of manipulating people, and we use science in that manner. And he was actually quite, I think, very insightful in terms of, things like homosexuality, incarceration, the definition of madness. All of these were cases in which science was used to marginalize certain groups in the interest of a kind of hidden power structure. The problem is that Foucault carried this to an extreme and basically began to argue later in his career that all of natural science, in a sense, just reflected these interests in power. And if you say that there's actually no objective reality, that everything is simply the projection of powerful people, of their view and their interests on the world, then everything is simply a matter of power politics, and it's not clear why anybody should actually be on the side of, let's say, the marginalized, because that's simply, projecting their power. So that was a trend that began really in the 80s, 90s, so forth. It was mostly confined to universities, but now it's drifted over to the far right. So every right-wing populist group, you probably have noticed, has made a similar argument about the COVID epidemic, that the public health authorities that are telling us to take vaccines, to wear masks, to do social distancing, they claim to be scientists representing objective scientific findings, but in fact they are acting in the interests of hidden elites that basically want to exercise power over you. And so the same idea that starts on the extreme left has gravitated over to the extreme right. And I don't need to tell you that this is dangerous because, in a liberal society, we agree that we're not going to agree about, ultimate truths as defined by religion. But if you can't agree on some basic empirical information like, is that vaccine safe? Who won the last election? Then, you've got a real problem. You're not going to be able to deliberate rationally, and you're not going to come to common decisions. All right, so the next issue has to do with the nation. And here I think that liberals have a certain problem because they do believe in the universality of human rights, that human rights need to be respected, whether it's in the United States, in Spain, in Korea, in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, anywhere in the world, people have equal rights. And yet the world is divided into nation states with limited jurisdiction. And for many liberals, this is a problem because they say, I care as much about the rights of people outside of my country as I do for my fellow citizens. And, what's wrong with that? And I think, there's nothing wrong with that in terms of the moral theory, but there's a practical problem because rights are meaningless unless they are enforced, and they have to be enforced by things we call states. States are this monopoly of power that is able to actually make people enjoy their rights because it has the coercive power to force the society to respect the rights of their fellow citizens. And states do not have unlimited enforcement power. And for that reason, we enforce rights within individual nation states. That's a lot of power. It needs to be kept under control. And for that reason, I think it's important that we organize ourselves in nations. The European Union is obviously an attempt to get beyond that kind of individual national selfishness, but it hasn't really succeeded in, there's no EU army or police force that can enforce the violation, can punish the violation of rights in an individual member state. The EU has not evolved that far, and as long as that's the case, you actually need states to do that enforcement. But more important thing is a kind of matter of human psychology, that we become less willing to express solidarity the larger the group becomes. And really the nation is probably the largest group to which we owe a kind of instinctive solidarity. And that kind of solidarity is important for social cohesion, for the ability to come to collective decisions, to work collectively as a political order. And again, for that reason, I think it's hard to eliminate national identity as an important factor that makes liberalism possible. But that sense of national identity has to be a liberal one. If it is based on a fixed characteristic like ethnicity or race that excludes a certain part of the population, then it's not going to be the basis for collective action. It's going to be the basis for exclusion and domination of one group by another. And so, in my view, we really need to have collective identities, but ones that are liberal, that reflect the kind of common values in human autonomy, in human equality that are embedded in liberalism. Okay, so I'm going to conclude by talking a little bit about geopolitics, because I think that what happened over the last couple of generations is that we really were living, certainly here in Europe and in North America, in an overall pretty peaceful and prosperous society. And in my view, it was peaceful and prosperous because it accepted this liberal international order. But not everybody has accepted it. And in fact, in addition to these populist nationalists within liberal societies, you've got Russia and China, two authoritarian states that have consolidated their power and are able to challenge that liberal order directly. And on February 24th, we saw the open, aggressive attack of Russia on a country that basically is a liberal society, Ukraine. I know this quite well because I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine over the last 8 years. I've felt really since 2014 that Ukraine was in fact a frontline state in a global struggle between liberal democracy and authoritarian government. And the Russian objective in this war is basically to eliminate the possibility that a Slavic nation or a Eurasian nation could be a successful democracy. That's the real challenge that Ukraine poses, that you can actually have a freely elected president, that you can have a system where people can criticize the government as they choose, which they do all the time in Ukraine. And that's really what's at stake. And it's really the entire European order that emerged after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the collapse of the former Soviet Union, that really is at stake in this war. And I think that in that sense, the Ukrainians, they're obviously fighting for their own sovereignty and their own freedom, but they're basically fighting on behalf of all of the rest of us. Because if Putin gets away with grabbing, the whole or a part of Ukraine, undermining it as a viable state, it's going to have consequences. Every other authoritarian leader around the world is watching this, and they will take lessons in terms of how firmly the rest of the democratic world back this particular country, whether its solidarity could be broken, through the energy weapon or through disinformation or the other tools that they have. And so I think that this is a very important struggle for all of us. However, I actually am fairly optimistic that the Ukrainians will be able to not just stop a Russian invasion, but will actually be able to defeat Russia, or at least to push them out of a lot of the regions that they occupied after February 24th. I can explain this at much greater length, but I think that it illustrates the difference between a free society and a closed authoritarian one. Ukrainians, even in the way they organize their military, spread power out. They delegate power to local officers on the ground. They encourage innovation and risk-taking, whereas the Russians have a very traditional authoritarian system where all of the decision-making has to be funneled through a hierarchy that ultimately goes to one person. And, in my view, the invasion of Ukraine was one of the biggest geopolitical mistakes that I've seen in my lifetime. And it was taken because of the authoritarian nature of the Russian regime, not just that Putin wants to show that his authoritarianism is better than a liberal democracy, but if you look at his decision-making, he was completely isolated during the COVID epidemic. You saw him sitting at the end of these gigantic tables because he was afraid of coming near other human beings. And, in a way, it's a good metaphor for what it means to be an authoritarian leader. You're not in touch with your people. You can believe whatever you want because you're living in a universe of just created by yourself and people that are immediately around you, and it leads to, really bad decisions. I think something similar is going on in China now with their zero COVID policy, which I also think is really a big mistake. So with that, I do have a little bit of optimism for the future if Ukraine is able to hold out, if NATO and the European Union show the kind of, or continue to show the kind of solidarity they have, which has been quite remarkable up to this point, then I think that it will be a victory for not just Ukraine, but for global liberal democracy. I hope that happens because it really means a lot to all of us. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to a discussion.